on a call before this, literally, and I was drinking my like iced cold brew, and I shit you not, a founder asked me how many glasses of wine I was in. I was like, bro, it's like fucking noon over here.
Oh my
Dude,
god.
literally, like a project founder, he gets on, he pitches his idea for 15 minutes, takes a full stop. Is that red wine? And I'm like you were mid pitch, like you were rolling over there, and I stopped and I was like, no, it's my cold brew. I have problems concentrating if I'm not completely caffeinated up. And he's just like, oh bummer, I thought we were matching. It felt like the bull market vibes were back.
Hey, John.
John, how's it going?
Hello guys, how's it going?
Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, of course, happy to. Thanks for having me on.
You know, we have heard awesome things about you from a number of people. Would love it if you could start by maybe telling us a little bit just about your background, kind of what drove your move to Protocol Labs, and what you're up to now generally.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, maybe rewinding. So before Protocol Labs, I worked for Palantir for about 4.5 years. I got to bop around a lot of industries. I was doing a lot. I mean, the things that Palantir mainly does is in like distributed computing. And in around 2016, one of my coworkers was super into Ethereum. He had lost money in the DAO hack, but he was still very bullish on like the space overall. And it was because of him and sort of like in the 2016 era of everything being super hypey that I started looking into crypto stuff, just trying to understand like what was getting this guy like so excited. And honestly, like at the time, I couldn't really put pieces together. Like I understood smart contracts and like what the promise of those might be, but it wasn't clear that there was like specific use cases that made obvious sense at the moment, which in my defense, most of the ICO era things from that time did not really pan out. So I think that was justifiable. But the one thing that really did stick with me was a talk that I heard from Juan, who's the founder of Protocol Labs, about IPFS. And the reason it made sense to me is because it was basically taking an idea that Palantir had built internally. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Palantir or what Gotham is, but like the big pitch with Gotham, which is the stuff they sell to the government, is like we're going to build software that just works wherever, whether you're in a skiff, whether you're in a desert, whether you're sitting in an office. The internet and like the applications that are built on top should just kind of work. But it was all like local to Palantir stuff. And IPFS was a vision for what if you could take that superpower and just apply it to the internet more broadly. So that made sense to me, but I was like very interested still in all the things we were doing at Palantir. But fast forward to 2019, I'd been there for 4.5 years, and I was sort of at that moment where people have like the reflection of like, what do I want to spend my time doing? And so, yeah, I mean, Protocol Labs is on the short list of things that I thought was like worthwhile to go spend a bunch of time. Turns out I ended up spending about 4.5 years there before starting this new company called Ansa. But yeah, I mean, at Protocol Labs, I got to work on most parts of like Filecoin. So I used to be the research PM that was helping shepherd Filecoin's proofs out the door before launch. Post that, I launched a number of storage on-ramps, things that bundle IPFS and Filecoin together. NFT storage and Web3 storage are kind of some of the more used products for doing that sort of thing. And then post that, I started a team with my co-founder, actually, HQ, called Filecoin TLDR, which was really just geared around like, how do we better explain what are the core theses that the ecosystem has? I think it can be easy sometimes in crypto to sort of like left curve it, which honestly is not a bad strategy for many things. But I think especially when you start talking to the mid-curve folks, the ones that are like, this stuff will never work. Here's why like crypto is like silly. Like I actually think there is a really solid first principles argument you can make for why decentralized infrastructure is the future. And so part of our goal with Ansa is like, how do we actually, if the meme is like you draw two circles and then the second thing is the full owl, it's like, how do we show the in-between steps of like how we actually get there and work with projects to actually accelerate that?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's always funny to me how many people get into crypto who got into it just losing tons of money. And it just speaks to this community of people that are willing to eat glass and eat glass for long periods of time, but continue to keep faith and build really amazing things. One of the things you mentioned there that I wanted to dig in on, though, is you guys really started this, and you started your journey into Protocol Labs with a set of theses and some ideas around where you thought the world might be going over the next 10 years. You mentioned you have this thesis around decentralized infrastructure as a whole. Would love to take a step back and talk about that for a second. So when you're talking about decentralized infrastructure, what specifically excites you? And then, when you're talking about some of these theses that you have, I'd love to dig into some of the things that, you believe are going to be true over the next 10 years.
Yeah. So I guess the best place to start is to like sort of reflect on like how does the web work today? I mean, this is bridging a little bit into like why content addressing, but I would argue like the core of most of my thesis at least is that like content addressing is a critical component to like the future of the web. And then on top of that, like if you underwrite the content addressing bet, you are basically you can see the pathway for how does decentralized infrastructure like Trojan horse its way into like replacing the cloud. So maybe to start there, um, I think there's a bunch of secular trends. Like, let's ignore crypto for 30 seconds about like, why do we, like, where is the internet going? And like, some of the trends to take a look at is like, how is hardware improving at the far edge? When I say far edge, I'm not just talking about like the Cloudflares of the world. I'm talking about like your MacBook or your iPhone and like, how is the storage on those devices improving? How is like the compute on those devices improving? And then relative to those improvements at the far edge, like the user devices that are all around us, how is bandwidth improving in relation to those? Like how much data can you transfer over the wire and where does that becoming a limiting constraint? What are the applications that we see on the horizon as people look? I don't know if you guys saw when Mark Zuckerberg did his interview with Lex Friedman, like the quality of the avatars that they're using for AR and VR. When we think about doing like machine learning and having things with federated models where we're distributing the applications to the edge, if you start like piecing through these trends, you could sort of summarize it as hardware is improving at the edge, data generation is going up, bandwidth is not improving at the same rate as those two things. And so that isn't saying that the cloud goes away. There are some things that you'll want to do in the cloud, but it is saying that you're actually going to pay more and more of a tax by being over reliant on the cloud over time. And I can qualify that in like two different ways. One is sort of like a financial tax in terms of like you're paying someone else rent when you could be doing things for free. If I can federate a model and run it on your local devices, I am not paying you to run on your own device. Like that is just a free operation because you already have the things with you. But two, you're paying a latency tax where like you're moving all of this data over the wire. And like if again, think about what is your bandwidth and like what you have at home. If you had to upload 100 gigabytes, how long would it take you? Like those are the types of things where it's literally slower and potentially more expensive at the limit to move everything to the cloud. Not saying everything doesn't go to the, or like some things don't go to the cloud, but there are some applications. And my claim is that over time, that balance of power will shift the desire to move more things out of the cloud over time. So like that is sort of like the thesis about like why content addressing, because the thing that it really gives you is an ability to define applications that are separate from the location where they run. So like if the way the internet works today is like I tell you like go to the library in New York in the middle of town and find a book 3 like bookshelves in, 2 books on the right, like that is how normal applications are designed where you're like saying go to this specific server, go into this file path to find something. That's a really bad way of defining the world because now we are all reliant on this one library or this one server. We all have to go to the same central location to go grab the thing. And whether that thing is actually even there is a question that we don't know the answer to. Whether that file path I gave you is the same file that I was originally referencing, you no longer know. But when you use content addressing, the thing that you're doing is you're defining data based on fingerprints of the data itself. You're saying, hey, you don't need to go this one server. Like maybe I tell you a server that might have the data, but you're always checking things against the fingerprint of that data. So whether it comes off of like my computer, an Amazon server, or if it comes off of Connor, your computer, like the end user, the end application doesn't really care. It just grabbed the data from wherever it needs to be. And so if you can change how applications work in that way, where you're saying like, I'm not going to lock you into using a specific server, I can now say like, you can build an application, you can solve for how we move the data out of band, but now I can easily port. So if I want to go from like AWS to Google, I could do that. If I want to go from AWS to Filecoin, I could do that. If I want to go from AWS to Arweave, I could do that. Like the data is agnostic of where it's being stored. You're just saying like, I care about the data itself. And that's like kind of the core principle of content addressing, which is like allow people to do things local first, meaning use their own devices. You can call out to other systems if you need to, but you're no longer locked in. And yeah, I could go on for longer, but maybe I'll pause there just to make sure that was like clear.
Yeah. No, super helpful, Jonathan. I think like from my perspective, like a non-technical perspective, that's how I would have how you described it at the end is how I would have described it to myself, or how I would have volunteered a description of it, is like kind of like project or server agnostic storage, like storage that can exist on the internet in a way that someone using Amazon could access it, even if it was on, Filecoin or vice versa. Kind of like how you described it. It also seems like potential like olive branch maybe between uh, storage competitors, both centralized and decentralized. I think I saw you had a couple of tweets about content addressing, how like Filecoin and Arweave could potentially even like work together in that way. Um, so yeah, just curious if you could maybe give an example from like a user's perspective on how that would work, like interoperability wise, just like a kind of like a high level, this is what it would look like for you, this is what we need to do to make that possible if it's not possible today.
Yeah. So maybe to help orient, and I don't know how many people watch versus listen, but think of IPFS as sort of like a rectangle, and like Filecoin is a square. Like all squares are rectangles, not all rectangles are squares. The big idea with content addressing is like separate from any individual layer that we're talking about after the fact. We just want a canonical reference that works everywhere, whether it's using a centralized service, whether it's using a decentralized service, whether it's using protocol A versus protocol B. You as an application shouldn't care. You just care that I have one canonical reference. And like the most obvious place that this matters is actually like NFTs. Because like an NFT, right? Like what is the thing that I want to write into Ethereum or into an ordinal or whatever is just like, here is a fingerprint of that data. I could store that data also on Bitcoin. It doesn't really matter, right? Like if Luke Dash Jr. or whatever wants to fork Bitcoin and try to like get rid of all of like the ordinal data, if you have the content hash, you can always rehydrate it from somewhere else and the ordinal doesn't break. Like the same thing could be true on Filecoin, where it's like maybe you store it on Filecoin and like in the future, someone comes up with a better system. Again, maybe it's like using DNA or something, like, or I don't know, like you etch it into stone. If you're using the content hash, like you've separated the problems. You can move the data out of Filecoin and move it onto DNA, so long as there's a good way of moving from like retrieving the data out of the DNA. But like that content hash is still the same. Like it is still like immutably tied to your data. And like this is the thing that makes Arweave a little bit weird, where like Arweave couples these things in a really not so great way, where it says like, here is a transaction hash. So like regardless of what the bytes are, you first need to now understand the Arweave world to say like, hey, if Arweave goes away, like someone has to maintain this relationship of like what transaction happened with whatever metadata, which is like an odd dependency. But the fix would be like Arweave does have this idea of like tags. So you can like write in the CID as like metadata. And like Arweave gateways could interpret the CID. If this, I don't know if they do this today, but I would highly recommend, if there's Arweave listeners, please consider. But like you could interpret the CID and then look through your index of like tags and the Arweave like history to be able to retrieve the data out. And in that way, like users are no longer like coupled, even if like in the future someone forks Arweave or whatever, like it doesn't matter. I know there was like some Iris drama on this as well. It doesn't really matter because it's just like the thing that matters is like the data is a fingerprint. It is not tied to a specific network or anything else. It is just the data. And then all of the other guarantees are like a function of the network that you've stored it on. But like you can uncouple these responsibilities is like the big idea of like why IPFS.
Yeah. Makes sense. Maybe to take a step back, and we'll circle back to competitive situations later and kind of what the landscape looks like. But it's very clear Filecoin is easily one of the most ambitious projects in crypto. And it's also evolved a number of times, as Ethereum did, as most successful projects within the crypto sphere did. Most recently, I know you guys launched the Filecoin virtual machine, and there's been some pretty interesting projects that have started to develop since then. I guess in your view, kind of what does the final state of the project look like, or is there even a final state? And then kind of what do we have to believe to understand what success might look like long term for the Filecoin ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe I'll start by saying I actually think more of this has been in the works. Like if you go back to the 2017 white paper, you'll actually see references to a lot of the different things that have like more recently launched. So you'll see a reference to like retrieval markets, which is what people were talking about in terms of like Saturn and CDNs. You'll see references to hierarchical consensus, which is sort of like IPC and like the scalability on that side. You'll even see references to things like file contracts where like people might program around it. So like there's definitely, I think, like a version of Filecoin that's like historically been maybe like under hyped or under discussed, but like these are all things that were kind of on the roadmap. I think specific implementations, there's like details that were not as clear that are more clear now. So like the FVM, one of the reasons the FVM is pretty interesting, and this is maybe a more technical reason why it's interesting, is it's built like a hypervisor. So you can have many VMs that sit on top. And so like the first version of that is like you can have an EVM which compiles to like the base layer FVM. So you can just port Ethereum contracts, but it gives you the flexibility of having other types of VMs sit on top. So there's teams that are working on this both to enable other types of smart contracts. So like you might have like a move VM in the future or like any other thing. But you could also have other types of VMs for things like compute. So like Fluence has like the Aqua VM, which like this gets a little bit more into like subnets. But like if you wanted to have compute as like a core part of like an on-chain framework, you could do that through the FVM. And so like the FVM and like its current instantiation is more about like how do we design flexibility into the system so that people can then configure it how it makes sense for the specific use cases. But like the idea of like we want programmability for these services has always sort of been there. I would say like if we think about what is Filecoin actually trying to shoot for and like what does success look like, my one-liner is it's like how do you build open services to compete with the cloud? Like I think that is probably an unhelpfully broad, but I think it's also sort of accurate. And it's not saying that Filecoin, the base layer protocol, does all of these things, but it hopefully provides the foundation that allows more of this to happen. So like Filecoin, the storage network, in and of itself is just like, you could think of it as like an enshrined dApp. It's like the first thing that actually exists on the network. And if you actually look at its implementation, it looks a lot like a smart contract that's kind of hard-coded, where like, and it's hard-coded for a specific purpose because it's also like enabling this other functionality of like helping secure with a bunch of the cryptography of the network. But like the important piece is like Filecoin, the base layer, is offering sort of this like acquisition of hardware, and it offers this super cheap cold storage, which is like a very specific use case. There is a market for cold storage. That's sort of like where I think a lot of the stored data is coming from. People who are using it for like archival or backup, sort of like the Solana Foundation is storing Solana's data on Filecoin. You have a number of folks who are doing that sort of thing. But like when we talk about what are the services of the cloud, it's way more multivariate than that. So like you have hot storage things. So like what is your S3? What is your CloudFront? Where are you getting your EC2? There's things that don't really exist also in the cloud. So when we talk about like verifiable compute, like these are all different layers that stack on top. And with programmability, you can start invoking these things together. I think it's also probably important that like, because these are all tied to like the same shared rails, it gives you like the substrate to also start building up the economies around it. So like, take as an example, like if you wanted to build like a lending protocol, which says you as a storage provider, you exist as an on-chain entity. You as an on-chain entity are paid by some third party into a contract. Like if I want to allow you to borrow against that contract, I now have the primitives that don't exist in TradFi, they don't exist in Web 2, but like I have the primitives to say like, hey, unless you as a storage provider are like paying back this loan on a specific cadence, I'll just garnish your wages. And like I can use the block rewards of Filecoin as like a backstop against that. And so like you can start doing things that you couldn't do in Web 3 or in Web 2, but do it in Web 3 while offering services that we know exist and we know there is a market for from like Web 3 into Web 2, if that sort of makes sense. So like as an end state, like the three verticals that I usually pitch people to like pay attention to, there's storage, which is sort of like there's the cold archival side that's coming from like the base layer, but there's teams that are working on the hot storage side. So teams like Banyan, teams like Seal that are working on like their own implementation sitting on top of Filecoin. You have teams that are working on retrieval. So that might be like Saturn, that might be teams like Titan. These are people who are building CDNs, things that are aiming for like millisecond, like sub 100 millisecond like latencies for like delivery of content. You have teams that are working on compute that can range from things like fully verifiable. So you have teams like Lurk that are doing recursive snarks with TIDs. You have teams like Zama who are doing fully homomorphic encryption. You have teams like Bacalhau that are doing like distributed compute. You have teams like IONET who are like leveraging the Filecoin GPUs as a part of their broader network to be able to do AI and like machine learning stuff. And so I think like you're sort of seeing like these different verticals that are taking like, what are the hardware that's like tied into the Filecoin ecosystem? How do we maximize monetization of that by like broadening the services that are available, which then end up being like net cash flows that flow into the Filecoin economy, which you can start building other applications in like DeFi and all of that other stuff around.
Yeah, no, that is awesome, and I think at the end of the day, a number of sort of innovative use cases, especially within storage, that only Filecoin is pursuing, and Filecoin has continued to pioneer. I think one that I wanted to touch on very quickly, and this might be more of a narrative thing, but there's been this long-standing view that retrieval was always a tough point within the ecosystem. But I understand that the network has made a huge number of investments into that category over the last year. Could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of, and I know you even mentioned it, there are teams sort of working on scaling retrieval, how that's kind of gone over the last year, and maybe some of the new innovations that have come to market that have sort of scaled that function? Because I think there's still a perception among a lot of people that that's the part of Filecoin that still isn't up to snuff with maybe what other competitors have been able to do, and I'd love to dispel that notion.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think you could think of it in two ways. So I guess historically, if you wanted fast retrieval in Filecoin, you had to pair like the base layer storage of Filecoin with other things. And so I still think that's actually a pretty good design in the sense that like there's different offerings that you may want. And like if someone is just trying to archive data, like you don't need fast retrieval, so you probably don't want to pay for it. So it's like, how do you get to the cheapest price point is always going to be an important question. I think how many guarantees do you get for hot retrieval layers is like a different thing. So before, people would use IPFS in conjunction with Filecoin. So like you would have effectively pinning services that basically also push stuff into Filecoin. With teams like Banyan, they're working on things like hot proofs, where basically like you get a lighter set of guarantees, but you're getting a snark that like basically posts into a contract. And so you have basically a similar design to like the base layer Filecoin, but with like not maybe the same sort of like robustness of what Filecoin is doing in order to get like the actual sampling of the data. But like that's like a basic primitive that's coming probably in like the next 2 months or so. Claudia, don't hate me if I misrepresented your timeline, but like things like that, which give you then composability. So if you wanted to write a contract on the base layer of Filecoin that consumes the proofs from Banyan, you could do that. Like the only flaw with doing this stuff with just IPFS in quotes is like it doesn't give you the ability to write contracts that say like, hey, if X doesn't happen, I need to like trigger Y. When you have things like these hot storage proofs, you can then start writing contracts around that directly on chain. The other thing that's coming, and this is like I think the newest version of like Filecoin's POREP, which I assume most people are unfamiliar with. Filecoin has two main types of proofs. One is like, how do we know what the data is that's being stored? That's called POREP. The other is like, how do I prove that over time? That's called POST. There's a new version of POREP that's coming out. This basically allows for another version of the data to be stored in a way that's fast retrievable. So like we will have things coming out of there that's more gate kept by the cryptography, but that's been making a strong strides and it should be coming early this year. But like those are the types of things that allow you to then like leverage like the cryptography side of like, if I want to build verifiable systems that consume this as an input, how can I do that with contracts? But I do want to like just make sure to like mention none of this actually changes like the utility. Like NFT storage as an example, which is effectively using like IPFS with Filecoin as like a backstop, like that is stored like 500 something TIBs of like NFT data by itself. Like I think in terms of volume, like we haven't actually seen a massive like I don't know what the right word is. Like it's not like Filecoin itself has like been blocked from that. What it's really challenged is IPFS pinning providers typically have limitations in terms of how big their data sets get. If you want to start storing like petabyte scale data, you're not doing like none of these systems. Anyone who's running stuff in the cloud, I guarantee you, like they will go bankrupt if they just try to like push everything into AWS or whatever. Like, so the only way to solve for really large scale data, and like the thing that's really interesting about DePIN is we're actually seeing those come like to market now. So like you look at like Hivemapper and how much data they're generating, it literally is just like a question of like, how do you maximize costs or like minimize costs? And like, how do you maximize like the utility that you can get by like moving to bare metal? And like, I think Filecoin is like maybe the furthest along on this, where it's like, hey, look, we have all of these data centers that are out there that are running Filecoin that are offering cold storage. A handful of them can be upgraded to do the sort of like at the edge hot storage offering. This is sort of what Banyan is doing today. And like, this is how you can actually get something that's cheaper than the cloud. Like I can actually push this out to a network of data centers and providers who are offering this service. The service is like actually getting like managed and like serving all the data that you actually needed to.
Yeah, well, really, really amazing at the end of the day. I think one of the things that I wanted to jump on there is I think there's a perception out there among VCs, among retail folk, among builders even, that storage is a commodity. And interestingly enough, it sounds like from all the conversations or from this conversation that maybe it's not, that there is product differentiation even within storage. So I guess I would love your view on that to some degree. Is storage really a commodity in the truest sense of the word? And how do you think about product differentiation as it comes to the products that Filecoin is able to offer? Because it sounds like there's a bunch of different products here at the end of the day for specific use cases, and the network is going to have to balance all of those and still provide the highest service quality at the same time. How do you think about balancing those two sides of the equation?
Yeah. So I think fundamentally, you can get fungibility if you like squint your eyes is maybe the best way of describing it. Where it's like there was actually a good paper from Paradigm. This was like last cycle where they were talking about like a protocol to create fungibility between like specific types of NFTs and like you do it based on specific properties. I actually think that's the right way of thinking about storage, where like depending on your use case, things may be fungible or not fungible. Like if what you're saying is like, I just need someone to hold on to this data, I don't care what location they're in, I don't care about any other property, like then storage can be like relatively fungible. But the moment you start saying like, hey, this is sensitive data, like this needs to be HIPAA compliant, this needs to like be stored with like data centers that have been like SOC 2 certified, like you're introducing things that make it less and less fungible, where like maybe there's fungibility inside of this requirement where it's like, I must store this data in a specific geography with data centers that have specific certifications. And like these are real requirements that come from enterprise. So if you like are in Web3 and you're talking about like somehow we are going to compete with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whatever, like these are things you will have to contend with. Like then like, yeah, you can create fungibility, but like you have to also understand that like the base layer protocol needs to account for the fact that like different users will have different requirements. And so I think you can think of these aren't like necessarily like, what's the right word? In contrast, it really is just a question of how you design your system. Another version of like, where will you get non-fungibility from is in terms of cost. So like, let's do a thought experiment for a second. And it's like, I have a protocol that's storing like a petabyte of data that maybe I want to have be the input for some training that I'm doing for like an AI job. It really doesn't help me to have all of my data sitting in like Buenos Aires if the cheapest GPU is sitting in Scotland. Like physically moving that data, like a petabyte of data, is expensive. It will be slow. And so like the price that that GPU can quote you is going to be fundamentally tied to like what is their supply chain of like, I have to get the data at a specific price point. I have to like quote both like the time and latency and opportunity costs of like moving that data there. And then I have to return it to wherever the data needs to go. So like even for the GPU networks, like knowing where the data is going to be an important part of their pricing model, where like if you want to be the cheapest GPU network out there, you want to have the lowest supply costs. Like you don't want to have to think about your like data separate from the GPU itself. And this is important for latency. And like if you've talked to like, I don't know if you've met Ahmed from the IONET team, like this is a theme that you will see more and more coming up, where it's like the moment you start moving out of like rounding error sizes of data, where it's like the data is relatively large, or you have to have like a fair amount of like data transfer or a fair amount of like read and write. Like locality is a really important feature, which like I think Filecoin is pretty uniquely positioned for, just because it's like kind of the nature of how the network is designed. But like this is actually like a primitive that people don't really think about. Now again, depending on use case, it may be more fungible, right? Like if I'm talking about an NFT, I don't necessarily care. Like if the NFT, and really this is a function of size. If I'm an NFT, I don't care if the data is a gigabyte. I could store it literally anywhere and like probably get reasonable enough retrieval speeds. But if we're talking about like terabytes of data, if we're talking about petabytes of data, like just think about what is the other implied costs that are in that supply chain, and it becomes quickly apparent that like these actually are not like completely substitutable things, because some things will be able to or like enable you to like drive a dramatically cheaper price point.
Yeah, got it. No, that's interesting. I think one of the things that came up in our conversation with the IONET team that was that stuck with me is they figured out this problem around clustering at the end of the day, right? Which is the
Yeah.
ability to co-locate and run models across different GPUs. And it's interesting that you bring up this point of proximity with regards to the GPUs and the data. Can you actually just expand on that a little bit for our audience? Because I think for people that are non-technical, this is a super important point that's maybe sometimes lost on people, how important it is that, you know, location be a factor in trying to make the best use of data.
Yeah. So, I mean, a thing that we sometimes don't think about is like data has a physical, like there's a quote that you'll hear, like data has gravity. And this refers to the fact that like data does take up physical space. Like literally we're saying like we're going to store all of these bytes on like a hard drive. And at certain scales, it's no longer like, oh, I can just like transfer the things over like the wire. By over the wire, I mean just like send it from my computer to your computer, just like over bandwidth. Like at certain scales, it actually becomes like prohibitively expensive or prohibitively slow to move large amounts of data. And so if you think about like what are all the required actions for like a compute job, the first thing is like take the data from wherever it is, move the data to wherever the compute is, run all the compute, and inside of that step, you may be doing more like moving of the data. This is like the clustering that Ahmed is talking about. But like you may have to move the data a number of times. And so like the thing that you learn pretty quickly in distributed systems is like the most expensive thing that you can do is to like introduce these like shuffles, like these movements of data, because it is both very slow and also like you have, we're talking about like between data centers, that can be like literally Amazon has a service called Amazon Snowball. I think they even have one called Snowmobile, where it is faster for them to literally ship a physical device than it is for them to send data over like the wire. So like this isn't really a question of distributed systems. This is even a question, or like this isn't a question of like blockchains or not blockchains. This is the question of physics. It's like if you have a pipe that is this fat, like there's only so much data that's going through. And so like what is the fastest way of transferring data? Sometimes the answer is literally just physical movement. When we're talking about clustering and all of the stuff that Ahmed's talking about, it's like making a specific set of trade-offs where you're saying like, I can get this like increase in parallelism by working with a market of GPUs. And that parallelism is worth it for a small, not like a large, but a very small amount of like overhead in terms of transfer. And like the question is like, how do you minimize that increased overhead of transfer? Which is why it's really important to nail like the locality of data problem. If what you're saying is like, I'm going to be moving data around the world, it's going to get super expensive really quick and prohibitively slow. And like that's the sort of thing which you just can't really do, which is why like figuring out how you cluster jobs to minimize the amount of like movement you have to do is super important. There's another team that's been working on this in a slightly different angle. I don't know if you've come across the Web3 Mind folks. This is like Vuk and Lucas and those folks. But like this is a core part of their thesis as well, where it's like literally just having to physically move large amounts of data is like this invisible problem that, again, it's like bounded by physics, not by anything else. And so like picking which data centers that you work in and picking your positioning is actually like a competitive moat, which isn't defined by anything other than physics, where it's like, if there isn't a faster pipe to move data around, you won't be able to do that sort of thing. I hope that was clear, but yeah. I mean, maybe actually
Yeah.
another version of this is like CDNs. People might have experienced this maybe more tangibly with like, if you go on YouTube on your phone, the ad loads really quickly, but sometimes the video is really slow. Like that's actually a function of the same principle where like the ad is cached locally by Google close to wherever you are because everyone in New York is looking at the same ads or at least like targeted similarly. But like the actual video, I might be watching some weird cat video that no one else in New York has ever seen. And so they're pulling it off a different server. So it's going to load at a different rate. Like that is the same principle at work of just like when you can cache stuff locally, things happen faster. But like there is like a physical like latency difference as well. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a super helpful example, I think, for non-technical folks about like, I guess the advantages of caching data locally and just everything you were talking about of like the physical location of data, I think is really interesting. We'll talk about decentralized storage competitors in a minute, but I want to get a quick kind of like compare contrast for our listeners on kind of like Filecoin and IPFS versus the centralized storage competitors out there. And I'm sure there's like kind of a million differences and levels of nuance we could go to, but maybe just like high level how does Filecoin and IPFS stack up versus a centralized storage competitor on kind of whatever metrics you think are important to discuss, whether it's cost or data availability, latency, UX, UI, kind of et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, so I think so IPFS as like a superset, I don't think is like, as I sort of said at the beginning, it's not like IPFS versus Amazon. It's like IPFS is a thing that Amazon could run, but what it does is it like uncouples the reliance of like an application on specifically Amazon. If when I was working at Palantir, one of the biggest things was like trying to get people to migrate can be like where their data lives can be like a 5-year endeavor because there's all of these dependencies that might break and you're trying to figure out how to do whatever. And so Palantir's big selling point with Foundry is like, oh yeah, we can like help make it easy to move between on-prem if you run your own data center or between the cloud. IPFS just kind of does that where it's like, look, you don't have to like trust some other computer, just use your own computers. You can run stuff in AWS if you want, but like the way that all your applications are built are agnostic of all of the underlying servers, and that gives you this flexibility to move stuff around. So like IPFS is sort of playing in that realm, and you've seen that even with decentralized networks where like folks like storage have support for IPFS out of the box because it's like, again, just like a canonical way that we can reference data. I think what's interesting about Filecoin and where Filecoin has had traction is like, so I think it's very clear if you talk to most people in the Filecoin ecosystem, what does it look like to climb the mountain where it's like, okay, end state is we have built a market-based version of the cloud. To get there, there's like many different things that have to be true, and there's many different things that you have to build. And so we're all the way down here at Basecamp 1, where it's like we have built this verifiable storage layer that gives us the substrate to build a lot of other things. And like the most important property that I think Filecoin brings that like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft do not have is like verifiability, where it's like I can get these proofs, and those proofs enable a market of providers to step in to offer things at a cheaper price point. To give a very specific example, so like Seal Storage is a team in our ecosystem. They have successfully been pitching into both universities, but also like research orgs to take like massive amounts of scientific data sets and translate them into like contracts, which they can basically like resell to other people on the Filecoin network using the proofs as a way of basically like backstopping. So like for them, if they're saying like, we're going to hold on to one copy, we're going to seed 3 other copies of this data with other providers, the proofs on the network gives them a way of knowing that these other copies are actually there. It gives them a thing to trigger actions based off of, where it's like, hey, if one provider goes down, how do we rehydrate to another one? It basically gives you a way of knowing like what's actually happening with all of the things that were like promised up front. And like the way Filecoin's crypto economics are designed is there's both collateral and skin in the game for these proofs. So if like someone is storing the data and they can't like actually supply the proofs, and they can only supply the proofs if they're actually holding on to the data, but like then the file or the miner would get penalized. And so like verifiability is kind of like the novel property that like Filecoin brings. But like especially for small data centers that are trying to sell into enterprise, this gives them an opportunity to say like, if everything else was equal, why would I not take Amazon versus this other third party? Because like there is a benefit for cost savings, but if that cost savings comes at the potential risk of catastrophic loss of all of my data, it's still a very hard sell. Like for most businesses, and I'm not talking about Web3, I'm talking about Web2. For most businesses, like a category, like a disruptive thing to their business is like a catastrophe. And so proofs give you a really interesting opportunity to say like, here's how you don't have to trust that I'm telling you that your data is still here. I can show you, and like you have a thing that is like not going to be like manipulated by me. Like everyone can verify that this is happening. Like proofs become kind of like the interesting feature. But I think like over the long term, the proofs just become the substrate to enable all of these other types of functions that I'm talking about with like, I want to write a storage contract that says, always make sure there's 5 copies of this data on the network. Well, it's actually possible to do that when I can get a proof and say like, have I seen 5 proofs of this data from different providers over the last 24 hours? If I haven't, then I want to trigger an auction to say like the next person who stores this gets a little bounty. Like this is how you would build like a perpetual storage protocol on Filecoin. You'd have to start using DeFi stuff in order to like actually make sure you always have money for a bounty, but you can sort of like extrapolate out how these things would tie to each other.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think it's interesting to talk about the kind of perma storage stuff. I think Mahesh will hit that in a second. One thing I wanted to hit before I wrap my questions was to talk about ecosystem at Filecoin and at crypto projects in general. I mean, I think as an outsider to the Filecoin ecosystem, kind of learning about it from outside the house versus inside, I've been really impressed at kind of the size and strength of the ecosystem. How many different teams are building infrastructure, DApps, looking at like the ecosystem fund, the grants program, even a lot of like I would say like Filecoin friendly VCs or VCs that are very interested in investing in projects in the Filecoin ecosystem. So, in your time at Protocol Labs working on the ecosystem side of things, like I'm just curious how you went about creating and cultivating that ecosystem and maybe what some of your biggest wins or lessons learned while working on the ecosystem side of things there were.
Oof. I mean, look, it definitely was not just me. There's like a lot of really smart people who had a lot of good insights. I think, so one thing I think projects probably might underweight is like, uh, keeping it like finding who are your core allies and how you can like best leverage them. I think the running joke usually is like a VC will say like, let me know how I can help, or like how can I be like helpful or whatever. And usually people don't have a good answer. And I would encourage projects to think more strategically about how to use the people who are on their side, where it's like, what are like useful synergies of like who are projects that they can introduce you to, like how do you build up more relationships, because like those are the sorts of things that can help snowball. um, Two, I think also is like thinking about like from the founder position all the way down of like what makes it easier for someone to say yes to like building your ecosystem. I think some of that is like thinking through what are like the public goods that you want to be able to fund, and like how do you want to be able to fund those things. I think thinking through like what is like the flow of capital over time. So it's like if you are someone who's just learning about something versus if you're someone who is like, I don't know, maybe you've got a successful hackathon project, and how you want to like build that pipeline of like how do I make sure that they have the ability to get capital at the various stages where they might need it. I think some of that is also like how do you make it easier for people to raise. One of the reasons why myself and my co-founder HQ originally started this like project with Filecoin TLDR is we found like there was a lot of people who didn't really understand Filecoin, or if they did think they understood it, it was more mapped to like a 2017 era like understanding of like what were the things that we're doing. And that can make it really hard. Like you don't want to put your founders in the position where like they're spending 40 minutes of an hour long pitch explaining what your project is. And so like I do think like people sometimes underweight like the value and the importance of like putting thoughts out there and putting it on paper, because like that is a tax someone has to pay, and like you can help your ecosystem grow by like having more of it out there. I think there's actually like relatively few ecosystems that have thought about this, and I would say like Filecoin is kind of late to this as well. But I also think it may be different for DePIN because we're kind of like more of an offshoot of the rest of crypto. Like I think if you there's lots of ink spilled about like modular versus monolithic and whatever. There's a lot less ink that has been spilled about the nuances of like Wi-Fi networks and like bandwidth and like CDNs and things like that. And so it can be much harder for people to anchor into the space with like a nuanced understanding. And so like my, I guess like most important, I guess piece of advice is like you as the founders are probably the ones who are best positioned to write. I would either find people on your team that are like understand the system well enough that they can, or find people who can partner with you that can like help translate what are like the core theses. Because a lot of it is just like make it easier for people to like see the things that you see and then want to participate.
Yeah, high quality content can definitely go a long way, and both just bringing attention, but also bringing minds and strong builders and good ideas to an ecosystem. And I have to say, I think Filecoin's ecosystem definitely looks like one of the most vibrant out there. That said, we recently interviewed Sam Williams, who's the founder of Arweave, and he had a lot to say that we wanted to maybe give you just a little bit of time to respond to quickly. One of his big claims, as we discussed, was that, Filecoin doesn't actually have a lot of revenue today, or that the revenue might not be real, was kind of the terms that were used. Now, we did a little bit of digging into it, and our sense is that what Filecoin has done is move towards a deals type model recently for sourcing revenue, working specifically with projects to source that compute. I'd love to give you a second, maybe, to just quickly address that, if you don't mind. I think it was a claim that you reacted pretty immediately to. I think we got a text almost immediately saying like this is bullshit to some degree. So would love to give you a second to just maybe take that claim apart.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess, okay, it's worth separating out, like, what are the different roles of Filecoin, because things can get overloaded quite quickly. There's, like, Filecoin, the network, and, like, what is the revenue that the blockchain has? The same way as, like, what is the revenue that Ethereum has? What is the revenue Solana has? Filecoin and, like, the things that are anchored into the network and, like, activity on chain is the thing that drives revenue, and it has, like, a fair amount of that. I think you could go on Token Terminal and, like, see those numbers. But notably, like that isn't the revenue from like people paying for storage. That's people for paying to secure the network, plus paying to use the smart contracts, paying anything that sends a message over the network. A very small incremental portion of that might be from like someone setting up a deal, but like that is not where like burn or anything comes from. This is like fundamentally different from Arweave, where like in Arweave's case, because Arweave as like a single function chain, it's like I send a payment into the endowment or whatever, like you can directly measure like storage usage is tied to like money flowing into endowment. And so like those two numbers are synonymous. In Filecoin's case, paying to use the chain is like one economy. The other economy is like me reselling my hard drive, which is also used to secure the network, but me reselling it to someone else to be able to like get dollars in my hand. Like up until the FEM, and arguably even now, because we don't have great stable coins on Filecoin, it's actually not easy to measure that latter thing. Like you can talk to different teams about this. So like teams like Seal have done a fantastic job of selling their storage. Teams like Banyan are building like on ramps that make it easier for people to do this thing directly. But like using actual USDC is not the easiest way, especially when there isn't like super deep liquidity just yet on these things. So like you don't actually see, and this also is a function of like how Filecoin's like on-chain deals work. It's not actually easy to observe those payments. And so I think like typically what happens is like there's a conflation between the two. But yeah, so I guess like the first order point is like there's like protocol revenue, which is like dramatically different from like what is the revenue going to storage providers. And then the revenue going to storage providers, there's a bunch of things right now which are not easily observable, which is like all the IONet payments that are going to storage providers, you wouldn't really see on chain because there isn't like a great bridge just yet. But like those are still cash flows that are flowing into these SPs. And so like it really depends on like how one wants to do the accounting, but it's like comparing a little bit apples to oranges. Does that make sense? Like the thing that I think like Sam is sort of missing is like observing on chain is different from like what may actually be happening. I think it's reasonable to ask the next question, which is like, how much credit do you want to go give to things which you can't observe just yet? I think that's totally fine. I would also say there's ways of lower bounding it by just talking to the teams that claim to have revenue and verifying their revenue. But like, I think that's like two different things that are probably worth like unpacking.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. I guess my follow-up question was actually going to be what would be the metrics that you would focus on for someone who is trying to understand the growth of the ecosystem and wants a sort of unbiased view on what's actually going on? What would you really think is important to look at?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, I'm actually working on this with a number of teams in Filecoin. Like, I'm actually really interested in like, how do we make stablecoin payments actually work? So actually, the reason for this is I think so. People have talked about real-world assets. I think one of the things that makes Filecoin interesting is like one view of what real-world assets are is like we're going to take all of these off-chain businesses, we're going to create complex legal structures, we're going to tokenize something and put that on chain, but then the security guarantee you have is basically like compressing down to like what is the strength of that legal agreement. And there's versions of this that have blown up already, but like that is sort of what real world assets are. And like maybe as we get better laws, those will improve. But there's a different version of a real world asset, which would be, okay, we have all of these businesses that exist as first class entities on chain. In Filecoin's case, literally every storage provider has a unique address. That unique address is like a Sybil resistant thing that's built up through all of this history of mining on the network, which could be the default place that you pay or make your payments. I can now write smart contracts that wrap that smart contract that allow me to do real world assets in the sense of like, I would like to garnish, like, I will issue a loan against your cash flows, which I can see flowing over the network. I want to be able to garnish your like deal flow if you don't pay me in time. And I have block rewards as a backstop to say like, if this person doesn't pay, like I can scoop some of their block rewards too. I think like this is the sort of thing which like isn't really possible in like other ecosystems. It's only possible when like the actual businesses are first class entities on the network. And there's teams that I think are like pretty close to having some of this stuff. But like that's the experiment that I'm most interested in. Part of what I think we're trying to also do for Ansa is work with a number of teams that are actually generating some of this revenue to build up like better dashboards that people can track. Like as we hopefully move more of these things on chain, it'll be easier to observe. But I would say like those are probably like two big things I would point people at as like what are things that maybe they should look for. One is like as more dashboards are built up, like looking at those dashboards, I think like tracing the sources is probably the most important thing you can do. Hopefully from the other side, we can get more people in the ecosystem to leverage the tools that are just coming online to be able to put those things on chain. But I think like that's like another set of work streams that have to like sort of happen. And then two, I think like is just like talking to the different teams. Like I think Mahesh, folks like yourself, like you should definitely at some point have Claudia and the Banyan team come on, folks like Seal Storage. Like I think as the friction of using things like the FVM and make all of that makes it easier for people to do the payments, I think we'll see those things show up on chain. But I think in advance of that, the next best thing is like find the teams and go verify directly, which would be like I think an area and an opportunity for folks at the platform like yourselves.
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day, we are trying to do everything we can to bring analytics, bring tools, and just bring visibility to a lot of this. And again, to all the points you mentioned, John, I think we have been big supporters of the Filecoin ecosystem for a while. We continue to believe in the project at a very deep level. There's definitely some amazing and innovative stuff happening there. And I think, again, just to reiterate your point, the thing about crypto ecosystems is unlike traditional finance, where you can kind of look at two valuation metrics and get a very good sense of what's going on. With a lot of these projects, oftentimes the real story is way under the hood and you kind of have to dig for it. So, with that, John, I think maybe we're going to wrap here. This has been an awesome episode. I think, the job you did in clarifying a lot of underlying ecosystem mechanics was definitely something that was really interesting to us. I enjoyed the conversation on content addressing. I think the one thing would love to leave you with is if you could tell our viewers maybe where they could find you social media wise or anywhere else that they can read your work or learn more about kind of the stuff that you do.
Yeah, so on Twitter, my handle is Jonathan Victor with no vowels. So JNTHNVCTR. Yeah, I still write for Filecoin TLDR every now and again. We have other folks in our team who do that as well. AnsaResearch.ai is our new company's website. But yeah, I would encourage people to give it a follow.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, man. This has been an awesome episode here, and we look forward to sort of continuing to catch up on everything amazing that's happening in the Filecoin ecosystem.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate the opportunity.